there were three PhDs at the Environmental Protection Agency, and they had a new chemical that was trying to work through the review process. And one of the PhDs stood up and said, this new chemical causes reproductive harm. This new chemical will lead to women having miscarriages. And he was working at the EPA during the Trump administration, and he was removed from his position, and the chemical went forward with the information about the harm removed.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Jane Van Dis. Jane is an assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Rochester, a practicing OBGYN, and the co-founder of Healthcare Without Harm. Over the past few years, Jane has also become an expert on the impact of plastic on our bodies. As you'll hear her say during this episode, this all began because Jane wanted to find out why her patients were getting sicker, which led her to an array of shocking discoveries which she shares on this episode, including the impacts that plastic have on our brains, our bodies, our fertility, our vital organs, our sex steroids, our cellular metabolism, and even our DNA. Jane begins with an overview of the plastic pollution crisis, explaining how much plastic is produced, how that's increasing every year, and how many hundreds of billions of dollars the industry is raking in through what she calls ecocide. She then explains the paradox for the healthcare industry, the amount of emissions and waste being produced by healthcare in the United States, and how it is difficult to fulfill the Hippocratic Oath in a society that is drowning in a man-made plastic problem. Jane then explains the fascinating links between industry and government, the economic and political power of the chemical industry to influence policy, shut down dissent, and how the fossil fuel industry exerted a decades-long plan to get us hooked on plastic. With plastic production set to increase by half by 2050, Jane paints a picture of what our global health could look like then, and it is a grim picture. She then gives 6 steps we can all take immediately today to minimize plastic in our homes and in our lives, which leads us to the conclusion that you can't get away with polluting the earth without polluting our own bodies. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Jane, thank you so much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's such a pleasure to have you on the show.
I could not be more thrilled to be here. I'm one of your biggest fans, and I tell everyone to check out either your podcast or your YouTube videos because, to be honest, you have interviewed all the people that I admire and who I think are having the right conversations.
God, thank you so much. That's such a wonderful way to begin this. I'm really touched. And thank you for recommending. I mean, I always wonder about how it is for an entry level. I sometimes wonder if there should be a start here, 10 episodes for understanding what the fuck is going on.
Yeah, no, that would be good. Yeah.
Listen, I'm going to give you the first question, and I'm really excited to see how you're going to answer this because, I've invited you on to talk about public health and plastics. Why is the world in crisis, Jane?
Well, given that I've listened to you for quite a while, I've obviously heard you ask this question to all of your guests. And so I've thought about it, right? Because there is no one right answer. But I have to say, I have been compelled by the argument put forth by Nate Higgins. I think he capsulizes or encapsulates so much of what the energy blindness that he refers to as the root of the problem. But to be honest, obviously, 200 years ago, humans had only begun to tap into this layer of sun underneath the Earth's surface, and the production of fossil fuels, which then led to the ability of Haber and Bosch to make ammonia out of hydrogen and nitrogen, which then fueled the Green Revolution, which allowed the population to grow as big as it has. And then, to your point, in some of the writings that you've done, a political and economic system that has allowed for unadulterated growth. And I personally started to ask some of these questions of myself back in the 2015, 16, 17. And I came across Nancy MacLean. She's a professor, I believe, at the University of Virginia, and she wrote a book called Democracy in Chains, and really highlighted for me that the reason that we are where we are, is it is a polycrisis and it's multifactorial, but the economic and political have enabled the growth and the consumerism that then has led to where we are here today in 2024, which is now a looming pollution crisis that we won't escape from. As we're going to hopefully talk about today, there is 2 times more mass of plastic on the planet now than there are animal life. So we talk a lot about animals. We imagine that they, have we conserve them, we protect them. Sometimes we slaughter them, but we don't imagine that the entity of plastic, which is made from fossil fuels, is in itself a huge entity that I feel like society is pretty much ignoring at our peril.
What brilliant overview and running. You should have your own show. That was great. That was so good. And pollution crisis. Excellent. There's the name of the episode right there. Plastic pollution crisis. To prepare for this, I read a paper that you sent me a while back and was shocked at what plastic is doing to us. Shocked, actually. In the beginning, there was just sort of generally pollution from fossil fuels. And I think I'm so glad to have you on to discuss this public health angle because, we know the impact of fossil fuels on the planet. That is typically a talking point. But the impact of fossil fuels on our bodies, the impact of plastics on our bodies is something that really kind of, I think, is only, as you said, we're only beginning to scratch the surface, not scientifically, but at least in sort of the public awareness or the media coverage of this problem. So I'd love to go through some of the facts and figures that I pulled up and have you talk a little bit more about them. And the first one was in the very first paragraph, which is that pollution, including air pollution, water pollution, pollution from lead and other chemicals, is the leading cause of premature death globally, with more than 90% of pollution-related deaths occurring in low and middle-income countries. That is astonishing.
Yeah. What I think is that we haven't really been able to name the entity that is pollution. And I think that obviously there's an absolute blindness, especially coming from America and maybe from the EU as well, at the effects of our society's production of pollution on the deaths of others. I do feel like here in the US, there has been more media attention recently, thanks to reporting from, say, Vox and Grist and Inside Climate News, really looking at the ways in which fossil fuel production and plastic production that is happening here in the US is responsible for deaths in communities of color. We have the term Cancer Alley, which describes the area in Louisiana where there's a lot of petrochemical distillation and plastics manufacturing. And the life expectancy there, I believe, for people in that area is 20 to 30 years less than an average Americans, right? And as one dives deeply into the plastic crisis, as it were, the question that one naturally asks is why has the system allowed so much um, adulteration of not only human life but all life? Because plastics and fossil fuel production is ultimately ecocidal, and the answer is that we obviously don't have any of the safety mechanisms or barriers to preventing this harm that people imagine. And something you might not know is that I took an environmental ethics class this summer through Antioch University. And my capstone project I had decided was to start a TikTok. So I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I found from her that 20 or that Gen Z gets or 20 to 30% of Gen Z gets their health information from TikTok. And I was like, I see it in my patients. In case the audience doesn't know, I'm a practicing OBGYN. So I mostly work in the hospital delivering babies. And so I see it in my patients that they are coming to me with questions about topics that they've learned about on TikTok. And so I decided for my capstone project for this environmental ethics class that I would create a TikTok channel devoted to talking about the health effects of plastic and also a little bit of reproductive justice. And I plan to talk about pronatalism as well. But something happened in the last few weeks, Rachel. So I had a TikTok about the study that came out from researchers at the University of New Mexico. And what they were looking at was they took adults that had died who had no family. And so these persons, they went to the morgue and they had deceased. And so they took their brains and they performed mass spectrometry on the brain tissue. And what they were able to show was that in about half of the 60 some people's whose brains they looked at, about half of them had 0.5% of their brain tissue was plastic. Now, you might not think 0.5% is that much, but it's actually by weight, it was quite a lot. And what they found was that they had actually performed a similar study in 2016, so 8 years ago. And what they found was that the amount of plastic that had been found in brains of decedents had increased by 50% in those 8 years. And then similarly, what they also found was that those persons who had a history of either dementia or Alzheimer's had anywhere from 5 to 10 times the amount of plastic in their brain. And I'll circle back to the origin of this story, which is the TikTok I created. So in this TikTok, I had been to Costco earlier in the day, and I had seen the rotisserie chicken. And, the rotisserie chickens in America, I don't know if it's the same in Europe, but they sit under a heat lamp and they sit in a plastic container surrounded by a plastic bag. And so in the TikTok, I kind of went off about the fact that, there's 3 ways that plastic gets into our body in an accelerated fashion. It obviously gets into our body all the time. The audience should know that plastic can enter across our skin. We breathe in plastic, and then, of course, we ingest it as well. But a way to accelerate the plastic into our body is through heat, through acidity, and the rotisserie chicken sitting under the heat lamp were obviously leaching plastic very quickly into that chicken. And so the video went viral. It's got almost 1.2 million views. And I'll tell you the conversations that I have, because I try and stay engaged on the topic with the people on the channel. People are A, flabbergasted, B, angry, C, despondent, um, E, they want to know how to get plastic out of their bodies. And while I feel bad for letting people know that, that this is happening in society, at the same time, I hope that they begin to think about how many plastic bottles or water they're drinking out of plastic bottles per day, not to heat their food in plastic in the microwave, and that corporations and governments have allowed this to happen. And to be honest, obviously, fossil fuel knew that climate change would come. They knew that there would be a moment of reckoning and decarbonization. And my impression, my theory is that they planned back in the 1970s when a lot of our food came in glass or paper, that they planned to get a society addicted to plastic. And if you look, the global plastic market in 2023 was $624 billion and is expected to grow at an annual compounding rate of 4.2%, reaching $876 billion by 2030. So to me, this is a concerted and thoughtful effort on the part of fossil fuel companies to make sure that society is addicted to plastic. As you might know, Dow Chemical has joined forces with Saudi Aramco. Dow is the number one manufacturer of plastic packaging. So it's not by chance that this is happening, Rachel.
I want to go off in about 20 different directions listening to that. And I think let's stay on this isn't an accident, and then work into the public health crisis, more the details about what it's actually doing to our bodies. So I have in my notes that fossil fuel consumption and petrochemical production are more than 15 times higher than they were in the 1950s. And petrochemicals account for 12% of global oil demand, but are on course to account for more than a third of the growth in worldwide oil by 2030, and nearly half by 2050, which is another frame on what you just said. And another thing which astounded me, which was that the FDA recently has denied requests to promptly reassess the safety of using certain chemicals in food contact materials. So it seems in the same way that fossil fuel with regards to our energy use and political power are tied up, equally, there seems to be this sort of disavowal of the problems that plastic is causing, and an unwillingness to adequately look at that. However, I think that the reasoning or the excuse is much flimsier, forgive the pun, because we do need energy to power our societies in some way. Do we need plastic? Could we go off of plastic?
Well, this is such a great question, and it's one that as you may know, there's currently a group of international bodies that are considering a global plastic treaty, and that they're meeting again in November to address that. And it was interesting. So I started an organization called OBGYNs for a Sustainable Future because I began reading about the crisis through the lens of medicine based on healthcare without harm. So they are an international organization dedicated to understanding the responsibility that medicine has to the health of their communities that they serve, but also obviously to the planet as a whole. And like you do, looking at the crisis as a polycrisis. So not only the types of emissions that medicine emits, and importantly, in the US, healthcare contributes 10% of all US greenhouse gas emissions, which is, aviation is at 2.5 or 4, depending on how you want to calculate it. And healthcare is at 10. So again, I feel like it's a ghost standing in the room that nobody is really talking about or addressing. But there is this sense that medicine or medical care should be exempt from the Global Plastics Treaty. Having said that, here in the US, healthcare produces more plastic waste than the entire country of the UK. And, all of the plastic waste in healthcare, either goes into the landfill and those chemicals seep into our groundwater and soil, or gets incinerated, which, as medical waste does, creates a lot of greenhouse gases. And so Healthcare Without Harm said absolutely not. You cannot exclude medical waste and medical plastic from the Global Plastics Treaty. And I and others signed a petition, to that effect. But to answer your question, do we need plastic? Probably we need some plastic, but we absolutely don't need the 40 million tons that are produced each year. And so thinking, critically and thoughtfully about where plastic needs to be is essential, I believe, to our survival and to the survival of all the species on Earth. Because as you know, we found plastic as high as Mount Everest and as low as the Mariana Trench, in addition to all of the 10,000 plus chemicals that reside in plastic. And that brings up something else. And I apologize. I feel like I'm just a brain of tangents. But something that people don't realize is that, the chemical industry is the plastic industry. So in the US, the chemical industry is 25% of US GDP. And so these chemicals that you referred to in the food packaging that the EPA and the FDA are want to protect us from are bolstered by an industry that has a lot of economic and political power. And so, I have to say, I read over the weekend, there was an article in the New York Times, and it was about some farmers in Maine. And what they had encountered was they were organic dairy farmers, and they sold their organic milk to Stony Brook or Stonyfield Organic Farms, the label. And one day they got a call that their milk had unacceptable levels of PFAS, which is a chemical that is added to food packaging and carpets and rain jackets and anything that says water resistant has PFAS in it. And so they got this call saying that they could not send their milk to the dairy anymore because it had the levels of PFAS were too high. And they thought to themselves, well, we haven't put anything on the soil that our cows are eating from. Where could this chemical have possibly come from? And it turns out that before they bought their farm, the EPA had for decades, 30 years, Rachel, been encouraging farmers to put sewage sludge fertilizer on their fields. And so this is human waste that then, gets quote unquote sterilized and then mixed with soil and probably, wood sawdust and put on fields as fertilizer. And so what they're finding then is that so many fields are actually contaminated with this PFAS. Now, Maine is now the only state in the United States that is testing for PFAS. And I believe the article said that somewhere between 20 or 25% of all of the agricultural soils that they tested were positive. And so what you've got is you have chains of ways that these chemicals are entering both our bodies as well as every living entity. As people are wont to say, PFAS is in every raindrop now. So now I've completely forgotten the question.
No, you answered it. It was, can we live without plastics? We will need it for sort of minimal uses, but we need to absolutely minimize the 40 million tons that we're producing each year. It does create a bit of a conundrum, though, for the medical industry, doesn't it? Because plastic has been a kind of fundamental and critical innovation for surgeries and I was about to say surgicality. For disposing of certain things that you're only meant to use once, of storage. I mean, can the medical industry survive without plastic? And how do you begin to offset the potential harms of using a thing that also that also has benefits? Like, where does the Hippocratic Oath fit in there when you're dealing with such a nuanced topic?
Oh my gosh, I love that question, and I will point back to something that that Healthcare Without Harm says, which is that as the only sector with healing as its mission, healthcare has the opportunity to use its ethical, economic, and political influence to create ecologically sustainable, equitable, and healthy communities. But Rachel, we are not doing that. We are actually the cause of a lot of harm. You know, the 10% of all greenhouse gas emissions, the plastic waste that is, you know, I think each day someone is in the hospital. On average, they generate 40 pounds of plastic waste. And so, can we do better? Yeah, we can. For instance, in my specialty, for those women out there who've had a pap smear, you know, with the speculum, women actually prefer metal speculums, but for some reason, the plastics industry has taught us that, you know, potentially maybe we need to use plastic instead of metal, when in fact we don't, right? And so the problem is that every single instance of the supply chain, or every single instance of a patient encounter, someone, whether it's a doctor, a nurse, a tech, someone from environmental services, needs to ask, how could we make this situation more sustainable? How could we limit emissions from this patient encounter? And you know, that's a tough question, because as you know, and probably all of the work that you've done, once you have supply chains in place, and once people are profiting off of all that disposable single-use plastic, it becomes cultural, right? So for instance, at my hospital, I'm not allowed to wear a cloth scrub cap during surgery. I have to wear a plastic bonnet. Um, is there data to show that the patient's more likely to have an infection if I wear a cloth scrub cap versus the plastic? No. No, there's not. And in fact, as you might imagine, industry puts studies out there that convince hospital administrators and people in charge of supply chain that plastics is better, that it's better for infection, that it's better for this and that, when in many instances it's not. But there's so much propaganda in the entity, right, to get healthcare addicted to plastic, that it's really, really hard to push back on. And then you have accrediting bodies, like in the US, we have JCO, we have the Centers for Medicaid, et cetera. And the incentives are not to decarbonize. The incentives are not to think about how we can use reusable versus single use. But they have to be if we're going to enact any change here.
Mm. Just as you were talking there, this like sort of fundamental paradox of wanting to keep even a sliver of modernity is that there will be losses and there will be gains. And how do you choose which losses to go for and which gains to go for? Who gets to decide what is being offset by what? Just exactly as you were explaining, some things can be reused. There will still be some single use. And the problem is that plastics are fundamentally harming us and chemicals are fundamentally harming our physiology. So even if we want to have a medical industry that can provide 21st century care, which is, you know, critical now, especially in nations where people are experiencing health crises and need medical care in order to have a quality of life, if not stay alive, then in providing that care, there is also this offset happening, whereby we're using tools that are fundamentally poisonous in the same way that we're using energy that is fundamentally poisonous. And yeah, I mean, who gets to decide? Certainly it shouldn't be lobbyists and industries themselves who are making a profit, but here we are. Jane, I'm aware that I haven't asked you yet about, like, could you go through and explain what the impact of plastic is on the body? Because I think I read that paper twice. It shocked the living hell out of me, quite frankly. But I'm aware some people listening may not know the full extent of this while we're railing against the the chemical industry.
Yeah. So what I tried to do when I lecture on this, and I provide grand rounds at hospitals, and I love to go to libraries, and I'm happy to tell anyone that wants to listen. But when I think about plastics, I divide it into two categories at first in terms of how they are impacting our bodies. So the first way that they impact, and people might think about this, is that they themselves obviously are a particle, or a piece of a structure, a physical structure. So imagine that a piece of plastic is floating around in your body. And let's say you get a plaque forming in your carotid artery, which is the artery right here in the neck leading up to your brain. And a plaque is comprised of cholesterol, it's got fibrin, it's got white blood cells. Sometimes it happens due to a little site of inflammation, and then the body rushes to sort of heal the area. And in the meantime, in the process of doing that, it forms like a blob or a plaque inside your artery. Well, some Italian researchers over the summer discovered that they removed the plaque from the carotid artery, and then they looked at it under the microscope. And what they found were a lot of plastic particles in that plaque. So we're not talking about the way in which the chemicals leaching from the plastic affected the plaque. That might be true as well. But we're talking about how the plastic helped form the architecture of the plaque. And people who had more plastic in their plaques had higher risk of cardiovascular disease, so heart attack and stroke. Similarly, we find plastic particles in blood clots. So studies have looked at blood clots in the brain, which cause stroke. And those who had more plastic in the blood clot in their brain had worse outcomes. Similarly, blood clots in the vessels of the heart cause a myocardial infarction or heart attack. And again, we're seeing plastic particles in those blood clots. So assisting in the architecture of deleterious health risks is one way that plastic is affecting our health. But I would say the bigger, times 100, the bigger way that plastic is affecting our health is actually in the chemicals which are put into the plastic, which then have deleterious effects on organ systems within our body. So for the most part, what we're talking about here are actually so many chemicals, right? 10,000, 12,000 chemicals that are added to plastic, only 25% of which have been deemed to be safe. So the precautionary principle here does not exist, which is to say that chemical companies are allowed to add chemicals to plastic without having to have studies showing that that chemical does not cause human harm. So we've really gotten ourselves into a really big bind here, right? Because these chemicals are leaching into our body. And, I am an obstetrician gynecologist. So the reason that I came to this topic of environmental health was because I was seeing my patients getting sicker and sicker. I've been doing this for over 20 years, Rachel, and I've noticed in the last, say, 5 to 8 years that more and more of my healthy young women, so these are women reproductive age 20, 30, that are coming with pregnancies, and they are being diagnosed with hypertensive disorders. So gestational hypertension, chronic hypertension, preeclampsia, all of which can be at some points so severe that their life is in danger from blood pressure and some of the other things that can happen, for instance, with preeclampsia. And I was looking around and I said to myself, why are all these women getting so sick? These are women who are otherwise healthy. And it occurred to me that there had to be something in the air, in the water, or in the food that was causing these numbers. So for instance, we've seen anywhere from 2 to 3% rise per year of hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. And unfortunately, I haven't yet seen, I'm waiting for the CDC or a research body to publish data from 2022, through 2024, But what we've seen up to 2022, the data shows, market increases, a 27% rise in gestational diabetes of pregnancy in 5 years, Rachel. Nearly 40% rise in obesity in 20 years. And so if you look, I think, there it is multifactorial what's causing this increased incidence of disease, but we cannot ignore the plastic in the room, because what happens is that those chemicals that leach into our bloodstream from the plastic, and, some people will say that we ingest a credit card's worth of plastic per week. I've seen refutations of that data. So we'll leave it out there. But regardless, it isn't zero.
Mhm.
But what happens with that plastic that we're ingesting is those chemicals leach into our bloodstream, and they have effects on our cellular metabolism. They have effects on our sex steroids. These chemicals will bind at sites on our thyroid. They will bind at sites on the ovary, and they interfere with testosterone. They interfere with estrogen. They interfere with progesterone. And in high doses, they can actually cause cellular damage or damage to our DNA. So they are having effects on the kidneys. They're having effects on the liver. They're having effects on the heart, on the lung, on the brain. One of the studies that came out this year that was so profound for me was done by one of the world's best researchers on this topic, Leo Tresand at New York University. He's a pediatrician, and he started to look at the health effects of these plastic chemicals on the pediatric population. And as is natural, he recognized that babies are actually being born pre-polluted, right? So the chemical insults that are happening to children actually happen while they are in the womb. And so he published an article this year, a very powerful article, looking at over 500,000 births, that 55,000 births. And what he was able to determine was that 1 out of every 10 preterm births can be attributable now to phthalates, which are, one of the main chemicals that are in these plastics. And then in addition, he and some other colleagues did an incredible study where they were able to show that the cost burden of U.S. Exposure to plastics and the chemicals in our plastics are costing U.S. healthcare $250 billion in 2018, the year that they ran the numbers for. So, Rachel, we are paying the human costs as well as the financial costs of exposure to these plastics and their chemicals. And yet I feel that it's a niche number of people that are either aware and or talking about this. But to me, it's the elephant in the room.
Would you say this is the biggest public health crisis that we have?
I don't know. Maybe I apologize. I don't have those acronym MPH behind my MD. I'm not a public health expert, and I really just came to all of this information through advocacy, right? Because I wanted to know what was harming my patients, and I'll be honest. I feel bad for my patients, right? Like I'm in the room with them, giving them a diagnosis of preeclampsia, which will mean that, they might have to deliver their baby at 34 weeks or before the babies are normally ready to come, because they and or their baby might die in the next few days if we don't do that, right? And my patients they're crying, they're devastated. They, like I said, they were otherwise healthy. And I wanted to be able to tell my patients, this isn't your fault. And it's so frustrating, Rachel, because this is the responsibility of the EPA and the FDA and all of the companies whose scientists, talk to ProPublica and say, we saw last week, there was an incredible reporting in ProPublica. There were 3 PhDs at the Environmental Protection Agency, and they had a new chemical that was trying to work through the review process. And one of the PhDs stood up and said, this new chemical causes reproductive harm. This new chemical will lead to women having miscarriages. And he was working at the EPA during the Trump administration, and he was removed from his position, and the chemical went forward with the information about the harm removed. And he and two others sued, obviously, for the retaliation that they experienced while they were at the EPA. And the ProPublica article that came out a couple of days ago was just basically saying the case was reviewed and they were found to be retaliated against for trying to protect public health.
Oh my God.
So it's really, really an upstream battle. And as you know, these agencies, these government agencies that are designed to protect us are underfunded. Rachel, I did a TikTok about the fact that the National Academies of Medicine, which is, the exalted, the high, the highest, the people who are supposed to be the absolute experts on medicine in the US, they had a webinar a couple of weeks ago about, introduction to plastics and human health. And they had 5 speakers. Rachel, one of their speakers was from Dow Chemical, the same company that is partnering with Saudi Aramco, the same company that is the number one manufacturer of plastic packaging. And the idea that the national academies would allow someone from industry. Now, mind you, this person worked at the EPA and then went to industry. And if you read that article from the New York Times about the farmers with the PFAS in their soil, there's a comment in that article from the comment section. And the guy says, I worked at the EPA and it's a brutal job. You're constantly under attack from political operatives, and it doesn't pay that well. And so if you want to send your kids to college, you might decide to go work for industry. And as you see with so many other things, you see this revolving door between, industry and government. And what it means is that the government gets captured by the industry. Our politicians are captured by the chemical industry, by the fossil fuel industry. And so what that means is that human health is a tertiary or quaternary concern by agencies that are there and designed to protect us, and they aren't doing it.
This seems like yet another example where we are attempting to treat the symptom and not the cause.
Yeah.
So the fact that US healthcare in 2018 was having to spend $250 million, $250 billion. That was the cost of healthcare that was essentially having to react to or treat exposure to plastic. Similarly, with the climate crisis, the kind of nonsense about carbon drawdown or we'll find some way to keep going. How did this happen? How did it become that health was forgotten about or is this an excellent example of how actually the well-being of people has never been a priority for decision makers or leaders, but rather profit and finding ways to externalize the waste that is always produced when we seek profit onto human beings and planet?
Oh, I think it's the latter, right? I don't think it's ever been at the forefront. I have a friend who's wealthier than I am, and I love him. He's one of my best friends, and he invited me to a gala, and it was to support the local cancer institute. And I sat there. I'm vegan, and I'll be honest with you, the vegan meal was not top notch. And I'm sitting there not eating my meal, thinking about the way in which all these people that have gathered to raise money for cancer, they have a good heart, right? They want to save lives, and that is noble, and we should be celebrating and honoring that mission and that goal. Having said that, listening to the speakers and the presentation, what you see is the same thing that's mirrored, I believe, in the fossil fuel crisis, which is that we will solve these problems with more technology.
Mhm.
We will solve these problems by giving research grants to people that will develop some niche area of expertise that will save some lives. But Rachel, if we wanted to save a lot of lives, if we truly cared about why cancer happens in the first place, we would look to the environment and the way in which we're polluting the environment, because cancer is the result of anthropogenic decisions about what kinds of toxicants we are going to allow our population to be exposed to. And the idea that we would allow the next generation, that we would allow babies in utero to be pre-polluted with fossil fuels, I always hope that somehow creates a pause in people's minds in a way that, say, lowering the average age of death from 79 to 69, like maybe that wouldn't be something that would motivate someone to care. But this idea that fossil fuels are pre-polluting the next generation is a profound one, right? And we have studies that show that if you compare an infant's feces with that of an adult, the infant has 10 times more pieces of plastic than the adult. If you compare the plastic chemicals, the endocrine disruptors in the infant compared to the adult, there's more in this younger generation. So I think what you're seeing is that as plastic production has increased, and I don't know if it's the same where you live, but here in America, you can't buy a vegetable now that isn't wrapped in plastic, right? Unless you go to the farmer's market, if you buy a cucumber, it's wrapped in plastic. If you buy lettuce, it's wrapped in plastic. And so what you're seeing is a preponderance, an increasing amount of this plastic that is permeating our bodies. And so in a way, like those of us who are older, when we were younger, there was less plastic around, right? So as each generation goes forward, they are going to have more and more of these chemicals and of this plastic in their bodies, and we're not talking about that.
Mm. And what do you expect to be the result of that? Continued endocrine disruption, possibly this link to Alzheimer's and dementia, increased problems, reproductive problems, fertility problems for men and women.
Yeah.
I mean, what does what does the public health of society in 2050, when plastic production has increased by almost half, what does public health look like in that world?
Well, it looks like, as a report came out the other day showing that we're seeing more and more cancers in 30 and 40-year-olds. Again, like a population that didn't used to have that problem. We're seeing more and more couples who desire to have children not be able to, again, due to fossil fuels' impact on male fertility as well as female fertility. So I feel like what we're seeing are these slow encroaching indices coming at the population from all sides. And I am thankful that, for instance, in that report about the fact that there's more cancer happening and more being diagnosed in 20 and 40-year-olds, or sorry, 20 and 30-year-olds, there is a mention I saw with my TikTok channel. People are angry, right? They're like, why isn't anyone telling us this? Why isn't anyone protecting us? But the fact is that if you were to go to Target or Walmart, you'd be able to buy a plastic baby bottle, right? And no one is telling that new mother not to heat up, for instance, infant formula or breast milk in that plastic bottle in the microwave. And so there just really isn't enough discussion about how the public can protect itself. And, and I do feel like there is this sense, especially here in the US, that if you want something, if you want to protect yourself from these harms, it's your responsibility, right? It's your responsibility not to get takeout food in a plastic container. It's your responsibility to know that your frozen dinner shouldn't be microwaved in plastic. But in a truly just society, those items wouldn't even be produced, right? Or there would be enough public harm, like with cigarettes, to say, if you do this, you might be endangering your health. But imagine if we had a label like that on every single piece of plastic packaging. It almost seems exotic to imagine a world in which we told people about the harms of plastic.
Jane, I think I'd be remiss to not ask you some medical advice for everybody listening who is as horrified as I am right now, most likely. What can people do? Because it is impossible now to totally avoid plastic. But what are the most important things that you as a medical doctor would recommend to your patients to try and minimize the impacts of plastic on our bodies and our health?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, there's three ways that plastic comes into our bodies, across our skin, in the water we drink, and in the food we eat, as well as the air that we breathe. And probably the easiest way to address is through ingestion, right? What we eat and what we drink. And so what I tell people is the number one most important way to avoid plastic is to not heat your food in plastic. So if you were, for instance, to heat your food in plastic in the microwave for 4 minutes, research has shown that you then are transferring over 4 million particles of plastic into your food in those 4 minutes.
Oh my God.
So that's number one. Don't heat your food in plastic. If you have a frozen dinner, remove it from the plastic container and heat it in glass. So that's number one. Number two is avoid plastic beverages. So it's very rare now that you can get a beverage, be it water or soda, that isn't in a plastic bottle. It's something like 70 billion plastic bottles are produced every year. I could have that wrong, but it's ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere. But if you can avoid drinking out of plastic, when I did my viral video, there was a guy that commented in the comment section, and he was like, I'm telling you people, I work at a distribution center in Arizona, and those plastic water bottles are sitting out in the 120 degrees sun baking. And remember, heat is one of the ways that you accelerate plastic into your body. So those soda bottles or water bottles are leaching a lot of microplastics into their contents. So carry around a stainless steel water bottle or glass bottle, and encourage your workplace or your school to install, water stations, so that there's more of a community approach to the fact that we don't have to drink water out of plastic. We actually can drink it straight from the tap. A lot of people in the comment section will say, well, my tap water isn't safe. And I totally get that. Having said that, they have created really good filters. So you can get a filter that filters out not only the microplastics, the lead, the cadmium, but also the PFAS. And so the filter technology has gotten better. So you're probably safer with your own tap water with a really good filter. I use one. It sits in my fridge. And it actually comes with a little device that you can measure the amount of particles in your water and prove to yourself that it's actually been filtered out. So that's number two. And then number three is kind of harder because 65% of all clothing nowadays is made from plastic. That's all the polyester that's around us. The French actually have a law coming into effect in 2025 that will require all new washing machines to have a microplastic filter built into the washing machine. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
brilliant. That's brilliant. Um, but if you read Matt Simon's book about microplastics, he points out that the majority of plastics are actually coming off of tires. As they abrade the asphalt, tiny pieces of plastic are coming off of tires, and then those are obviously getting washed away, and they're going into our waterways. So if you can, in America, car culture is almost impossible to address. But if you can carpool, if you can get a bike, I just got an electric bike and it's so fun to ride, right? If you can move closer to where you work, so you're not having to transport as much, obviously saving on fossil fuels, but also the amount of plastic coming off of transportation.
You've blown my mind. I am just sort of gobsmacked. I mean, I knew it was ubiquitous and insidious, but I don't think I really quite had grasped to what extent before. This might not be a great question to bring up towards the end of the interview, Jane, but I'm going to do it anyway, because obviously minimizing plastics is hugely important. But as you were talking, I was thinking as well, there must be these chemicals everywhere, right? In tins of food, cans, metals, they must be kind of coated on a lot of the things that we use. So how do people choose, shall we say, which is the lesser evil when it comes to plastics or metals in their sort of day-to-day lives?
Yeah. Well, the answer is probably what your audience expects, which is that when you can make your own food, that's going to be the safest. And avoiding soup cans and cans of vegetables, as you remarked, they are all lined with plastic. As unfortunately are aluminum cans, and I should have said that when I was talking about the plastic bottles, because aluminum cans are lined with the phenols as well, and so drinking regular water from your tap if you can, making as much food as you can. And I feel like this is a really difficult thing to say, right? Because the way that our economy functions now, we almost have to rely on either quickly prepared food, someone else preparing our food, food that's ready to go at the supermarket. Because unlike in previous times, we don't have the time in our daily life to soak beans overnight or prepare food from scratch. I feel like the questioning of this whole trad wife situation being coming from right wing politics. I feel a little bit bad saying you should try and prepare your own food. Having said that, that is the answer. And of course, voting in politicians who will hold industry accountable. But I feel like, isn't that something that's been said? Like, I'm sure Rachel Carson thought that uh, that might work when she wrote Silent Spring. So, I guess as much as you can do on your own, know that if you can afford organic, it is better usually because something that's come to light recently is that a lot of pesticides have forever chemicals in them. So people aren't recognizing that pesticides come with PFAS. And so if you can buy organic, I recognize that means that's also sort of a socioeconomic and political recommendation. And I want to be cognizant of the fact that being able to buy organic is something that probably, not everyone can afford to do.
Oh gosh. Oh, everything's so bad. Everything's such. Do you know what? I do a lot of episodes on like, the poly crisis and kind of like energy stuff, economic stuff. And whilst the impact of these things are very real, hurting the most vulnerable, hurting our environment, hurting our bodies, hurting ourselves, there's something that feels so personal about this episode. about the pollution in my body, in your body, in our bodies. And something darkly beautiful about the fact that we cannot pollute the earth's body without equally polluting our own. Mm.
Yeah, that is so powerful. Um, Something that's come to my mind since I started doing this work is, and I'm curious, I'll throw a question at you, and that is why ecology, taking care of the earth, why that isn't a core curriculum subject in every year of schooling.
Is there a right answer to this, or are we riffing?
Well, I'm just like, when I look at where all the problems come from, I look at the fact that there's nothing in our educational system that prepares us for taking care of the earth. And yet this is our home.
Yeah.
And, the more ecological education I myself get, the more I recognize that this information is so valuable and essential. Why isn't it being taught? Why it feels very niche, right?
Yeah. But I think it's because of this tension between our economic incentives, economic system, and the biophysical reality. Because if you were to teach people to take care of the earth and take care of their own body, this is another thing that's totally missing essentially from education, which we fundamentally need. Knowing how to take care of oneself is not some innate thing. We see it in other mammals that learn from watching their elders as well. And because society is moving so fast and technology is rapidly accelerating how our relationships degrade, essentially, we don't really have anybody to learn from. So, this way, how to take care of oneself, how to take care of each other, how to take care of the earth. If you were to teach all of that, then you wouldn't really have an active and viable capitalist system because they don't go hand in hand. There has to be extraction and there has to be pollution for this fossil fueled neoliberal economic system to work. So you need people to not know how to take care of themselves. You need people to not understand how important it is to take care of themselves. I think that's why it would upend everything if we began to think of the Earth's body as an extension of our own, and our own bodies as being valuable assets to take care of as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah. Now this is the pollution of our own bodies is really frightening. Like I said, I didn't really understand the extent of this. And you mentioned forever chemicals as well. This is a glib question, but are they really forever?
Yeah. So, I mean, what many people think about when they think about, for instance, the degradation of plastics, taking 100 years. No, it's actually more like 200, 300, 400, 500 years. It's hard for us to imagine those types of time frames, that something that we create today, that we use for 10 seconds, will now exist on the planet for 500 years. And the forever chemicals, the chemists, they just are not seeing how these fluorine carbon bonds are going to break down. So we could be talking timelines of thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years that those chemicals that we've created will be around. And that's why, in addition, the geologists I know rejected the idea of the Anthropocene, but maybe they wouldn't reject the idea of the Plasticine.
Hmm. Yes, indeed. And then as well, how this tumbling through the cascading effect of all of this on the environment as well, things that we cannot possibly predict. It is wild, the experiment that we are conducting with the only habitable place in the universe for all known life. It is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
I think often about the movie Wall-E,
Yes.
that little robot that just went around cleaning up trash.
Yeah.
Um, with a numbed out space population that were obese and didn't speak to one another anymore,
Oh,
and
I know.
how prescient it seems that movie was. Jane, I don't want to take up any more of your time, and I don't know about listeners, but I need to go and sit with this. This has been a huge amount of really, really important information. Thank you so much for coming on. My final
Yeah.
question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Well, I've thought about this because, as I mentioned at the outset, so many of the people that you've interviewed are my heroes. You know, Nandita Bajaj, I took her class, Jason Hickel, Nate, Phoebe Bernard, just so many incredible people. But one person that I thought of that is doing incredible work in looking at the intersection of food and climate is Kenny Torella, and he's at Vox. And I don't know him personally, but I have a friend who knows him personally, so I'd be able to get you in contact with him. But he's done a couple of articles recently along the same lines, looking at the way in which, for instance, the cops are not addressing the role of agriculture, the emissions from agriculture, our obsession with animal agriculture, and the way in which we encounter profound cultural norms when we talk about changing the way that we produce food. And since food and water are kind of the main ways that we get polluted with plastic, I thought that might be a great segue.
Jane, thank you so much for the advocacy work that you're doing and for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. It's profound, and it is changing opinions and lives, and I look forward to your book.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.